Clara Boone thought her biggest problem was loneliness. She thought the ache in her chest came from watching other women get chosen, while she, the quiet cowgirl with calloused hands, faded into the dusty backdrop of Coyote Bend. She could outride, outshoot, and outwork any man on the plains, but in the currency of courtship, her skills were worthless. She had made a hard peace with a life of solitude, her only companions the horses she understood better than people, and the 300 acres of ranch land her father had left her. It was a good life, a full life. She told herself that every single morning. But she was wrong. Her biggest problem wasn't loneliness. It was the secret buried deep beneath her boots, a secret worth more than all the cattle in the territory. A secret men were willing to kill for, and they were coming. She just didn't know it yet. The morning it all began, she found the stakes. They weren't there the night before. Now they stood like a row of skeletal fingers pointing up from her east pasture, thin wooden posts driven deep into her earth. Each one bore a small metal tag with numbers and symbols she didn't recognize. Her heart started a frantic, ugly rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't a property dispute. This was an invasion. The stakes formed a perfect line, cutting straight through her best grazing land, a line that ran directly over the natural spring that kept her cattle alive through the brutal prairie summers. Someone had trespassed. Someone had surveyed her land. Someone wanted what was hers, and they weren't asking politely. Clara yanked the first stake from the ground with a grunt, the wood groaning in protest. She moved down the line, pulling each one from the earth, her anger building with every splintered post. This land was all she had left of her father. It was her blood, her history, her future, and she would rather die than give up a single inch of it. As she loaded the last of the offending markers into her saddlebags, a sound like rolling thunder echoed from the west. A herd of wild horses, a river of brown and black muscle, crested the hill at a full, panicked gallop. Their eyes were wild, their manes streaming like banners of fear. They were running from something unseen, something terrifying. Leading them was the Black Devil, a stallion of local legend, a creature too proud and fierce for any rope, a ghost of the plains that ranchers had been trying to capture for years. He drove his mares forward with desperate urgency, his powerful body a testament to untamed freedom. They swept past Clara in a whirlwind of dust and snorts, heading for the relative safety of a deep ravine. But in his desperate flight, the stallion made a fatal error. He didn't see the hidden wash, a deep, eroded cut in the earth, until it was too late. He stumbled at full speed. His legs tangled. He went down hard, rolling twice before his magnificent body came to a sickening final rest at the bottom of the gully. The herd scattered in confusion, their leader broken and fallen. Clara didn't think. She reacted. Spurring her mare, Sage, she galloped toward the ravine, her own anger forgotten in the face of the stallion's tragedy. His front leg was bent at an impossible angle, the white of shattered bone a stark slash against his black hide. He was trying to rise, thrashing in the dirt, but it was no use. Clara was halfway down the slope when another rider appeared at the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the morning sun. He was the largest man she had ever seen. Taller than any man in Coyote Bend, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sky. He had to be the one her neighbor, Old Pete, had told her about. The mysterious new hand at the Morrison place, the one they called Bear. And the moment he saw the fallen stallion, his entire demeanor changed. The calm observer was gone, replaced by a man of intense, focused purpose. He descended the slope with a grace that seemed impossible for his size, his eyes locked on the suffering animal. Clara was already at the stallion's side, murmuring the soft, soothing words her father had taught her, the universal language of gentle reassurance. The stallion's eyes, wild with pain, fixed on her, his thrashing stilled. "Legs broken clean through," the big man said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. He crouched beside the horse, his movements economical and sure. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. "But the bone's not shattered. If we're smart, we can save him." Clara looked up at him then, really looked. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, but his eyes were the color of a gathering storm, and they held a startling kindness. In them, she saw a gentleness that seemed at odds with his formidable size. This was a man who understood strength, but chose compassion. "You know horses," she said. It wasn't a question. "Some," he answered, his hands already probing the injured leg with an expert's touch. "Learned a few things from an army veterinarian during the war, about setting bones." Without another word, they began to work. It was like they'd been partners for years. They fashioned a makeshift splint from tree branches and strips of fabric torn from Clara's spare saddle blanket. He held the stallion's head, speaking in a voice so low and hypnotic that the terrified animal seemed to fall under a spell, while Clara, following his quiet instructions, bound the broken leg. It took nearly an hour, but the Black Devil, the untamable ghost of the plains, remained preternaturally calm under the big man's touch. When they were finished, the horse could stand, shakily, favoring the splinted leg. "He'll need a safe place to heal," the man said, wiping horseblood from his hands. "Somewhere quiet." "My barn," Clara heard herself say. "I've got an empty stall, and I know horses." A look passed between them. It was a silent recognition, a shared understanding that went deeper than words. They both knew some things were worth saving, especially when the world considered them broken. Together, they coaxed the stallion up the gentle slope of the ravine and began the slow walk back to her ranch. The rest of the wild herd followed at a distance, unwilling to abandon their leader. "I'm Clara Boone," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Eli Maddox," he replied. "Most folks just call me Bear." "Why Bear?" A smile touched the corners of his mouth, transforming his rugged face. "Size, mostly. And I've been told I can be dangerous when I'm cornered." There was a shadow in his eyes when he said that last part, a darkness that hinted at a past where being cornered was a real and terrible possibility. But watching him with the injured stallion, all she had seen was patience and a profound gentleness. They settled the stallion, who Clara decided to rename Shadow, into her largest stall. As Eli prepared to leave, Clara found herself searching for a reason to make him stay. The afternoon had felt like a lifetime, yet it had passed in a heartbeat. "The surveyor's stakes," she said suddenly, remembering the morning's violation. "I found them in my east pasture. Someone marked my land without permission. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The warmth vanished from Eli's expression. The storm clouds gathered again in his eyes. "What kind of stakes?" She described them, and with each detail his jaw tightened. When she finished, a long, heavy silence stretched between them. "Harlan Creighton," he said finally, and the name sounded like a curse. "Cattle baron from up north. He's been buying up small ranches all through this territory, trying to build an empire." "Buying them or taking them?" Clara asked. "Depends on how stubborn the owners are." Eli's voice was hard as iron. "Be careful, Clara. A man like Creighton doesn't believe in boundaries, not property lines, and not the law." "Are you warning me as a neighbor?" He met her gaze, and his eyes held a chilling certainty. "I'm warning you as someone who knows exactly what happens when good people stand in the way of a man who thinks money makes him God." The words were heavy with personal history. Before she could ask him what he meant, he tipped his hat and turned to his horse. "Thank you," she called after him, "for helping with Shadow." He paused, one foot in the stirrup, and looked back at her. The setting sun cast his giant frame in gold and shadow. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer now, "for caring enough to try. Not everyone would have." As he rode away, disappearing over the rise, Clara stood in the doorway of her barn, the stallion nickering softly behind her. Her mind was a whirlwind. The threat of Harlan Creighton, the mystery of Eli Maddox, the stake still lying in a pile by her barn door. Trouble was no longer a whisper on the wind. It was here. But as she turned to check on her new patient, she realized something profound. For the first time in years, She didn't feel entirely alone in facing it, and that feeling, she suspected, might be the most dangerous thing of all. The small wooden horse was a masterpiece, no bigger than her palm, yet every muscle, every line of its flowing mane, was carved with an impossible precision. It was the work of someone with patient hands and a gentle soul. Eli had left it on her fence post 3 days after the rescue, a silent offering. She'd found out about his hidden talent from young Tommy Morrison, her neighbor Pete's great-nephew. The boy had come running to her barn, breathless with the news that the black devil was in her care. "Uncle Pete says Bear helped you," the 8-year-old had whispered, his eyes wide as he peered at the magnificent stallion. "He says Bear's got magic hands with horses." Then Tommy had proudly produced the carving from his pocket. "Bear made me this, said every cowboy needs his own horse." Clara had taken the small treasure, marveling at it. This wasn't idle whittling. This was artistry. This was the work of a man who saw the spirit of a thing and knew how to bring it to life. And so, a new rhythm began. Eli would stop by each evening, officially to check on Shadow's progress, but his visits grew longer, more personal. They fell into an easy routine, sharing coffee from her father's old chipped tin pot as the sun bled across the horizon. They talked about cattle and weather, but slowly, carefully, the conversation drifted into more personal waters. "You grow up on this land?" Eli asked one evening. "Born in that house," she'd said, nodding toward the sturdy stone building. "My grandmother delivered me herself. Doctor couldn't make it through a spring storm." "Must be nice," he'd said, a wistful note in his voice, "having roots that deep." "What about you?" she'd asked. "Where's home?" A wall had come down, a subtle shift in his posture, a careful blankness in his eyes. "Haven't had what you'd call a permanent home in a long time. Work takes me where it takes me." She sensed layers to his story he wasn't ready to share, and she didn't push. Everyone had secrets, but his only made her more curious. She began to notice things about herself, too. She started braiding her hair more carefully before he arrived. She started wearing her mother's old blue shirt, the one that made her eyes look less like faded denim and more like the prairie sky. The realization that she was preening for a man was both thrilling and terrifying. Then, Sarah Mitchell arrived. She rode into Clara's yard on a pristine bay mare, looking like she'd stepped out of a catalog from back east. Her dress was the color of buttercups, her skin like porcelain. Sarah was the banker's daughter, the undisputed belle of Coyote Bend, and she radiated a confidence that Clara had never known. "Clara, darling, I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Sarah had trilled, her voice like wind chimes. "I was just so worried about you, all alone out here. It must get terribly lonely." Her eyes swept the ranch, a flicker of something that might have been pity, or perhaps calculation, in their blue depths. "But I hear you've been entertaining visitors lately." The implication was as sharp as a spur. "Eli Maddox has been helping with an injured horse," Clara had said, feeling a defensive heat rise in her cheeks. "Of course," Sarah had purred, her smile a little too bright. "He's certainly caught the eye of every woman in town. So strong, so mysterious. I imagine any woman would be flattered by his attention." The unspoken part hung in the air. "But a man like that would naturally choose a woman like me, not a rough-handed rancher like you." The words hit their mark. All of Clara's old insecurities came rushing back. She was a fool to think a man like Eli would see anything in her beyond a competent pair of hands. That evening, when Eli arrived, she was distant. She was brisk and businesslike, declining his offer of coffee on the porch. "Everything all right?" he'd asked, his storm-gray eyes full of concern. "Fine," she'd lied, "just tired." She watched him ride away into the dusk, a hollow ache in her chest. She was protecting herself, she told herself, protecting her heart from a hurt she knew was inevitable. 3 days later, the confrontation she'd been dreading finally came. She was mending a fence in her south pasture when 3 riders approached. She recognized the leader instantly, Buck Henley, a hired gun whose loyalty belonged to the highest bidder, and everyone knew who was paying him these days. Harland Creighton. "Morning, Miss Boone," Buck called out, his smile all teeth and no warmth. "Just taking a look around. There's some question about where your property lines really run." "I know exactly where my boundaries are," Clara said, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle on her saddle. "And you're on the wrong side of them. A woman alone might want to be more accommodating," one of Buck's men sneered. The threat was clear. Her world narrowed to the space between her and the three men, the air thick with menace. And then, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to speak, another rider appeared over the rise. It was Eli. But the gentle giant she knew was gone. In his place sat a man who radiated a lethal stillness. His eyes were not stormy now. They were frozen chips of ice. When he spoke, his voice was deceptively soft, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Problem here?" he asked, positioning his horse between Clara and Henley's men. Buck's confidence flickered. "No problem, just a friendly chat with the lady." "Conversation's over," Eli said. "Says who?" one of Henley's men challenged. Eli smiled. It was not the warm, kind smile she'd come to cherish. This smile was a promise of violence. "Says me." Something unspoken passed between the men, a predator's assessment. Buck Henley looked at Eli, and whatever he saw there made him back down. "We'll be seeing you, Miss Boone," Buck said, gathering his reins. "You think real careful. Sometimes stubbornness costs more than a person can afford." As they rode off, Clara realized her hands were shaking. "Who were they?" she asked, though she already knew. "Trouble," Eli said grimly. "They work for Creighton, and they just delivered his first official warning." He looked at her, his expression deeply troubled. "Clara, this is serious. You need to be careful." The fear and frustration of the past week boiled over. "How would you know?" she snapped, the words sharper than she intended. "You've been here 2 weeks. What makes you such an expert on my problems?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. "Because I've seen what men like Creighton do to people who stand in their way," he said, his voice heavy with a terrible certainty. "And I've seen what happens to good people who try to fight that kind of power alone." His words were not a hypothesis. They were a memory. "I appreciate your concern," she said stiffly, the walls around her heart rebuilding themselves, brick by painful brick. "But I can handle this." "Clara, I said I can handle it." He looked at her for another long moment, a flicker of hurt in his eyes, then he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "but if you change your mind, you know where to find me." He rode away, leaving her alone in the vast, silent pasture. She had pushed him away. The one person who seemed to see her, truly see her, and she had pushed him away out of pride and fear. That night, she sat on her porch, the unused coffee tin beside her like a silent accusation. Was she protecting herself, or was she just proving Sarah Mitchell right? Was she the kind of woman who was incapable of holding on to anything good? She looked out at the gathering darkness, wondering if some chances, once you threw them away, ever came back again. The wedding ring was a simple gold band, tucked away in a faded silk pouch at the bottom of her mother's old dresser. It was her grandmother's before that, a thin circle of gold that had witnessed generations of Boone women love, laugh, and grieve on this very land. Clara slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. She had her mother's hands, she realized with a jolt. But her mother had been soft, delicate, the kind of woman men wrote poetry about. Clara was not. She was calloused and capable, her hands more familiar with rope burns than embroidery needles. A soft knock on the kitchen door made her jump. She quickly slid the ring off and hid it away just as Eli stepped onto her porch, his hat in his hands. He looked uncertain, a look she'd never seen on him before. "Hope it's not too late," he said. I came to apologize for this morning, for pushing." Clara's throat tightened. Men like the ones she knew didn't apologize. They swaggered or they vanished. Eli's simple act of contrition felt more intimate than a kiss. "You don't need to apologize," she said, stepping back to let him in. "You were just trying to help." "Have I?" she asked, a humorless laugh escaping her lips. "Because from where I'm standing, it feels like everything is falling apart. The fence is down, the well is failing, and now a cattle baron is sending his thugs to my door." "You're not alone in this, Clara." The words were a lifeline, and she wanted desperately to grab hold, but a lifetime of self-reliance screamed at her to be cautious. "Aren't I? People leave, Eli. It's what they do." "Is that what you think?" he asked, his voice low. "That I'm going to leave?" "I think," she said carefully, "that you're a good man, and good men like you don't stick around a place like this with a woman like me." "What if I wanted to?" he asked, stepping closer. The space between them crackled with unspoken energy. "What if I told you I've been thinking about staying in Coyote Bend? What if I told you I've found something here, something worth fighting for?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. She turned away, afraid to let him see the hope warring with the terror in her eyes. "That's not practical, Eli. I'm not the kind of woman men like you choose. They want someone softer, someone like Sarah Mitchell." She gestured helplessly at herself, at her work-stained clothes and rough hands. "Look at me. I can birth a calf in a blizzard, but I burn biscuits. I don't know the first thing about being the kind of woman a man wants to come home to." The words poured out of her, a torrent of insecurity she'd held back for years. "You don't know me, Eli. You don't know that I talk to my horses when I'm lonely, or that I'm secretly terrified of thunderstorms." He listened to it all, his expression growing more tender with each confession. When she finally fell silent, he reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You're wrong," he said softly. "About what?" "I do know you," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I know you're the kind of woman who would risk her own neck to save a wild animal. I know you work harder than any 3 men and never ask for a thing. I know you're loyal and brave and stronger than you think you are." His eyes held hers, a universe of sincerity in their stormy depths. "And I know that any man who would choose a pretty face over a heart like yours is a damn fool who doesn't deserve you." He took a breath. "Clara, women like Sarah Mitchell don't have half your courage." Before she could process his words, before she could argue or retreat, he leaned in and kissed her. It was nothing like she'd imagined a kiss would be. It was gentle and questioning at first, but when her hands fisted in his shirt and she kissed him back, a fire ignited between them. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and shared sunrises, of unspoken admiration and a deep, soul-shaking connection. When they finally broke apart, breathless, she stared up at him in wonder. "That," she whispered, her lips tingling. "That was my first kiss." His eyes widened in surprise, then softened with something that looked like awe. "Then I'm honored," he murmured. The tender moment was shattered by the thunder of hooves in her yard. Not one rider, many. Eli's demeanor changed in an instant. The gentle lover vanished, and the dangerous protector was back. He moved between Clara and the door, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his hip. "Stay behind me." Through the window she saw them, 5 riders, their faces obscured by the darkness, torches flickering in their hands like malevolent fireflies. Buck Henley was at their head. "This is my land," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. "I won't hide in my own house." She stepped onto the porch, Eli a solid wall of strength behind her. "Evening, Miss Boone," Buck called out, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Seems you got yourself a guardian angel." "I've got a friend," Clara retorted. "State your business or get off my property." "Business is simple," Buck sneered. "Mr. Creighton has made you a generous offer. He's advising you to take it. Accidents happen to stubborn folks out here. Fences get cut. Wells get poisoned. Barns catch fire. Eli's voice was a blade in the darkness. That sounds like a threat. Just an observation, Buck said. He then turned his gaze directly to Eli. Of course, a man in your position might want to think twice before getting involved. Word travels fast, and some words travel faster than others. Clara felt Eli go rigid beside her. Buck knew something from Eli's past. My troubles are my own, Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. But anyone who threatens Clara is taking on troubles they aren't ready for. A silent battle was waged across the yard, a confrontation steeped in a history Clara didn't understand. Well, Buck said finally, a smirk on his face. We've said our piece. You think hard on it, Miss Boone. And you, he said to Eli, think about what kind of company you keep. Some associations are more dangerous than others. The riders melted back into the night, leaving a heavy silence behind them. What did he mean? Clara asked the question that was screaming in her mind. About your position? About your troubles? Eli stared out into the darkness where the men had vanished. The weight of the world seemed to settle on his broad shoulders. There are things in my past, Clara, he said, his voice heavy with a regret so deep it was almost a physical thing. Things I ran from. Buck Henley knows what they are, and he'll use them to destroy not just me, but anyone I care about. What things? She pressed. He finally turned to face her, and in the lamplight from the kitchen, she saw the raw pain in his eyes. The kind of things, he said quietly, that will make you wish you'd never laid eyes on me. Clara reached out and took his hand. His large, capable hand that had soothed a wild horse and held her with such tenderness. She felt the calluses and the scars, and she knew she wasn't letting go. Try me, she said. But even as she said it, she could feel the secrets gathering between them, a storm cloud on the horizon. The kiss had been real. The threat was real. And Eli's past, she was beginning to suspect, was more terrible than anything she could possibly imagine. The branding iron was a piece of her family's soul, forged by her grandfather, its handle worn smooth by 3 generations of Boone hands. The brand itself, a B for Boone nestled inside a star for hope, was their story stamped in iron. As she worked alongside Eli during the spring branding, she felt a sense of rightness, of partnership, that was entirely new. The easy rhythm they'd fallen into had deepened since their kiss, charged with an unspoken promise. I could get used to this, Eli said during a break, wiping sweat from his brow. The work? She asked, though she knew he meant more. The company, he replied, his gaze direct and unwavering. Before she could answer, 2 riders crested the hill. It was Sarah Mitchell, and this time she had a man with her. He was handsome in a polished East Coast way, dressed in clothes that cost more than Clara's best saddle. Clara, darling, Sarah called out, I'd like you to meet James Wellington. He's visiting from Boston, and I've been showing him our charming territory. James dismounted with practiced ease. Miss Boone, he said, his smile smooth as silk. Sarah has told me so much about you. It's remarkable, a woman running her own ranch. The words were a compliment, but they felt like a judgment. Back home, we tend to think women are too delicate for such labor. Clara felt Eli tense beside her. Women out here are more practical than delicate, she replied coolly. Oh, but surely you dream of more, James pressed. A woman of your intelligence could do so much in a proper social setting, with the right guidance, of course. James is being modest, Sarah interjected, her smile sharp as a knife's edge. He's incredibly successful, railroads, and, she added, letting the word hang in the air, he's unattached. The matchmaking was so blatant it was insulting. Did Sarah think she was so desperate for a man that she'd fall for this condescending peacock? James, this is Eli Maddox, Clara said, deliberately drawing Eli into the conversation. James gave Eli a dismissive glance, the kind a man of wealth reserves for hired help. A pleasure, he said without offering his hand. James, didn't you have something you wanted to discuss with Clara? Sarah prompted. Ah, yes, James said, turning his polished smile back on Clara. Sarah mentioned you might be interested in selling. I'm always looking for investment opportunities. Perhaps we could find you something more suitable. A dress shop in town, maybe? The condescension was a physical slap. He was telling her she wasn't a real woman, that her life's work was an unbecoming hobby. Every insecurity she'd ever had rose to the surface. But before she could lash out, Eli stepped forward. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. Miss Boone's hands tell the story of honest work and accomplishment, he said, his gray eyes locked on James. Any man worth his salt would see them as beautiful. James's eyebrows shot up in surprise. I'm sure you mean... I mean exactly what I said, Eli interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Clara Boone is the finest woman in this territory, and any man who can't see that reveals more about his own limitations than hers. The silence was electric. Sarah's perfectly painted mouth hung open. James's expression shifted from condescension to a dawning, angry understanding. I see, James said slowly. My assessment of the situation appears to have been incomplete. After they rode off in a cloud of strained silence, Clara turned to Eli, her heart a wild drum in her chest. Thank you, she whispered. I meant every word, he said. He then looked at her, his expression serious. Clara, I don't want different women. I want you. The words, a mirror of a confession she'd once dreamed of hearing, stunned her, and in that moment, she knew she had to say it. Whatever complications are coming, she said, her voice trembling but strong. Whatever your past is, whatever trouble follows you, I want you, Eli. All of you. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic beat of his heart. You don't know what you're asking, he murmured into her hair. You don't know what it could cost you. Then tell me, she pleaded, pulling back to look into his tormented eyes. Trust me enough to tell me the truth. She saw the war inside him, the desperate need to confess versus the instinct to protect her, and protection won. I can't, he said, the words like stones. He stepped back, the space between them once again a chasm of secrets. The rejection was a physical blow, but she refused to let it break her. If he needed time, she would give it to him. But as they returned to their work, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was the one thing they didn't have. Days later, she found it. She was helping him with a thrown shoe on his horse when her hand brushed against a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle deep in his saddlebag. What's this? She asked, pulling it out before he could stop her. His face went pale. Something from my past, he said, his voice strained. Her fingers, numb with a sudden premonition, unwrapped the cloth. It was a sheriff's badge, real silver, etched with the words, Sheriff, Wyoming Territory. You were a lawman, she breathed. For 8 years, he confirmed, sinking onto a hay bale as if his legs could no longer support him. The story came pouring out then, a torrent of poison he'd held inside for 2 long years. He told her about being a sheriff in Cheyenne, about discovering a web of corruption that went all the way to the top, a network of bribery and murder orchestrated by wealthy landowners to steal land from honest people, a network run by one man in particular. Harlan Creighton, she whispered, the name now laced with a new, more personal venom. Creighton was the king, Eli said, his voice raw. And my boss, Sheriff Marcus Webb, was his pawn. I spent months gathering evidence, enough to bring them all down, but they found out. The evidence vanished, and they framed me. They put out a warrant for my arrest, claiming I was the corrupt one. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Then they tried to kill me. So you ran, she said, understanding crashing down on her like a physical wave. I ran, he confirmed. A dead man can't testify. And Buck Henley. Henley knows the story. Creighton sent him. It was a message. They know who I am. They know I'm here. His face was a mask of despair. Which means my time here is up. I have to leave, Clara, before I bring all this down on you. No, she said, the word a steel rod in the crumbling ruin of her world. Clara, you don't understand. No, she repeated, striding toward him, her eyes blazing. You told me you found something worth fighting for. Did you mean it? You know I did, he choked out. Then fight, she cried, standing before him. Fight here, now, with me. She held up the badge, the silver catching the lamplight. This doesn't represent the men who betrayed it. It represents the oath you took, the man you are. They can't take that away from you. He stared at the badge, then at her, something shifting deep in his soul. Even if I could, it would put you in unimaginable danger. I'm already in danger, she shot back. Creighton wants my land. He won't stop, and I won't let them drive you away either. She pressed the badge into his hand, her fingers covering his. Don't you see, Eli? You didn't just run. Of all the places in all the territories, you ended up here, where Creighton was making his next move. You weren't running from your past. You were running toward a chance to finish it. The truth of her words hit him like a lightning strike. He hadn't been drifting. He'd been hunting. He pulled her to him, his control finally shattering. 2 years of fear and loneliness and suffocating guilt poured out of him as he buried his face in her hair. I love you, he whispered, the confession torn from the depths of his being. God help me, Clara, I love you too. They clung to each other, 2 broken pieces finally made whole. If we do this, he said, pulling back, his eyes now clear and resolved, there's no going back. Creighton will come with everything he has. Then we'll be ready for them, she replied, her voice filled with a courage she didn't know she possessed. But as they stood in the quiet sanctuary of the barn, planning a war they could not possibly win, neither of them saw the shadow detach itself from the darkness outside. Buck Henley had heard every word, and by morning, Harlan Creighton would know that the fugitive sheriff he'd tried to bury 2 years ago had just pinned his badge back on. The battle for Coyote Bend was no longer a threat. It was a promise. Dawn broke across the prairie, painting the sky the color of a fresh wound. Clara crouched behind a water trough, her father's Winchester rifle cool and heavy in her hands. In her pocket, pressed against her heart, was the deed to her land. It was more than paper. It was her legacy. She counted them as they crested the hill. 38 riders, an army. At their head was a man she'd never seen but knew instantly, Harlan Creighton. He was tall and silver-haired, radiating an aura of absolute, untouchable power. Eli stepped out from the barn, the newly polished sheriff's badge on his chest gleaming like a defiant star. "Creighton!" he yelled, his voice carrying in the tense morning air. "I have a warrant for your arrest." Creighton laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "You always were naive, Eli. Did you really think that tin star could stop me?" He gestured to his army of hired guns. "The mathematics don't favor you." "I've got federal marshals on the way," Eli bluffed, his voice steady. "Have you?" Creighton pulled a piece of paper from his coat. "Funny. I have a telegram here that says their train has been delayed indefinitely." Clara's blood ran cold. It was a lie. Eli had sent word, but there was no guarantee. They were on their own. "Miss Boone," Creighton called, his sharp eyes finding her. "This is your last chance. Sign over the deed and your friends can walk away. Refuse, and their blood is on your hands." Clara stood up, her rifle held ready. The eyes of 40 men were on her. "This land is not for sale," she called back, her voice ringing with defiance. "Then you're a fool," Creighton snarled. His eyes, however, flickered past her toward the road leading to town, a look of smug anticipation. He was expecting someone else. Before Clara could process it, another group of riders appeared, but not from the town. They came from the east. At their head was a woman, Sarah Mitchell. She rode to her father's side, a triumphant smirk on her face. "See, father," she said, her voice carrying. "I told you the rancher girl was too stupid to be reasoned with." Creighton was her father. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. The friendly visits, the condescending advice, the matchmaking. It was all part of a calculated plot. And James sends his regrets, Sarah continued, looking directly at Eli. He was so disappointed you weren't interested in his business proposition. He's my fiancé, you know. He's a full partner in my father's enterprise. Every piece of the puzzle slammed into place, forming a picture of deceit so profound it stole Clara's breath. She hadn't just been overlooked. She'd been targeted, manipulated, and played from the very beginning. "It's over, Eli," Creighton said. "But I'm a generous man. I'll make you a final offer. Not for the land, for the water." "Water?" Eli asked, confused. "Don't play dumb," Creighton boomed. "The aquifer. The reason I've spent 2 years and a fortune securing this worthless patch of dirt. The railroad is coming through, and they need a water source. A permanent one. Your little spring is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a veritable underground river beneath this ranch, and it's going to make me the richest man in the territory." The surveyor's stakes, the obsessive need for her land. It was never about cattle. It was about the one resource more valuable than gold in the arid West. "A secret your father knew all about, Miss Boone," Creighton added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He made a deal with me years ago, a handshake agreement to sell when the time was right. But the fool got sentimental and backed out." He smiled, a cruel, twisted expression. "He died before I could persuade him to honor his word. You see, your sainted father wasn't a hero. He was a coward. The lie was meant to break her, to shatter the foundation of everything she believed in. But as she looked at Eli's steadfast face, at the determined set of Pete Morrison's jaw, at the grim resolve of the townsmen who had come to fight for her, she knew it wasn't true. Her father hadn't been a coward. He had been protecting her. And then all hell broke loose. The first shot came from one of Creighton's men. Eli returned fire instantly, his movements a blur of deadly precision. The yard exploded into a maelstrom of gunfire, smoke, and screaming men. Creighton's army charged, a wave of violence meant to overwhelm them in seconds. Clara worked the lever of her rifle, firing, reloading, firing again. Her mind was a calm island in the center of the hurricane. A rider bore down on her, his face a mask of hate, but Pete Morrison's shotgun boomed, and the man vanished from his saddle. "Fall back to the house!" Eli yelled. They were outnumbered, outgunned. Men were falling. Charlie West, her neighbor, lay still in the dust. The blacksmith, Jake Stevens, was bleeding from a wound on his forehead, but still firing. The world became a nightmare of noise and fear. Through the swirling smoke, she saw Buck Henley take aim at Eli's exposed back. All doubt, all fear, vanished. There was only ice-cold fury. She brought the Winchester to her shoulder, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. Her shot splintered the wood of the barn wall inches from Henley's head, sending him diving for cover. She had their attention. But it wouldn't be enough. They were being systematically surrounded, picked off one by one. The house wouldn't hold for long. This was it. This was how it ended. And that's when they heard it. A new sound. Not the ragged chorus of their own guns or the overwhelming thunder of Creighton's army. It was a disciplined, rhythmic volley of gunfire coming from the west. From the road to town, help had arrived. But as the riders came into view, Clara's heart plummeted into an abyss of despair. It wasn't the federal marshals. It was a posse of 20 men, all wearing badges. And at their head rode Sheriff Marcus Webb, the corrupt lawman, the man who had framed Eli and tried to have him killed. Creighton's face split into a triumphant grin. His final piece had just moved onto the board. "Well, well," he boomed. "Sheriff Webb, right on time! Arrest these outlaws!" Webb rode to the center of the yard, his face an unreadable mask. He looked at Creighton. He looked at Eli. Then he reached into his coat. "Harland Creighton," Webb said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I have a warrant for your arrest. For conspiracy, corruption, and a list of other crimes so long it'll take the judge a week to read it." The world stopped. Creighton stared at him, his face a grotesque mixture of shock and rage. "Webb, have you lost your mind? I own you." "You owned me," Webb corrected calmly. But the governor and the U.S. Marshals made me a better offer. My testimony against you in exchange for a reduced sentence. It seems my knowledge of your criminal enterprise is suddenly a very valuable commodity. Betrayal. Cold, calculated, and absolute. Webb hadn't found his conscience. He'd simply found a better deal. "You snake!" Creighton roared, drawing his gun and firing wildly at Webb. The shot shattered the stunned silence. The battle erupted again, but the dynamics had shifted entirely. Creighton's men were now caught in a crossfire, trapped between Eli's desperate defenders and Webb's disciplined posse. The fight was short and brutal. Caught by surprise, surrounded and betrayed, Creighton's army collapsed. Some surrendered. Most did not. Buck Henley made a break for it, but a single shot from Eli's Colt dropped him from his saddle. Within minutes, it was over. Harland Creighton stood alone in the center of the carnage, a king surveying the ruins of his empire. He still held his gun, but his shoulders were slumped in defeat. "It's finished, Harlan," Eli said, walking toward him, his own gun steady. For a moment, Creighton looked like he might surrender. Then, a final spasm of malice twisted his features. He wasn't looking at Eli. He wasn't looking at Webb. He was looking straight at Clara. "If I can't have it," he snarled, raising his gun. He never finished the sentence. A single shot echoed across the yard, but it hadn't come from Eli's gun. It had come from Sheriff Marcus Webb's. Creighton crumpled to the ground, a look of profound surprise on his face. Webb holstered his pistol, his expression unchanged. "Loose end," he said, to no one in particular. The silence that followed was absolute. It was over, truly over. Clara lowered her rifle, her arms trembling with exhaustion, and flew down the porch steps into Eli's waiting arms. They were alive. They were together. As Webb's men began securing the prisoners, Eli looked at his former boss. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only a weary understanding. "Why, Marcus?" Eli asked. "Why him?" Webb looked at the body of the man he had served for years. "He knew too much, about me, about others. A man like that can't be allowed to testify." He then looked at Eli, a flicker of something almost like respect in his cold eyes. "You were right about the law, Eli. I was wrong. Justice has a funny way of working itself out." Webb turned and mounted his horse, ready to deliver his prisoners and face his own judgment. The territory was not saved by heroes. It was saved by broken men making desperate choices, by traitors turning on their masters, and by two people who refused to let go of a stubborn, impossible hope. Justice had been delayed. It had been twisted and corrupted. But in the end, it had arrived. 6 months later, the air smelled of autumn and new beginnings. The new brand, a B and an M, intertwined beneath a single star, was struck for the first time on a healthy young calf. The Boone Maddox Ranch was thriving. The territory was healing, too. With Creighton's empire dismantled, honest people were finally breathing freely. Sheriff Eli Maddox was a busy man, but he always made it home by sunset. One crisp afternoon as they finished their work, they saw a familiar sight. Shadow, the black stallion, stood on a distant ridge, his own wild herd grazing peacefully behind him. He was free, yet he never strayed far, a silent guardian watching over the place where he'd been shown a kindness he'd never forgotten. "He could go anywhere," Clara murmured, leaning against her husband's strong frame. "But he chooses to stay close." "Maybe he found something worth staying for," Eli said, kissing the top of her head. He then pulled a folded paper from his pocket. It was the deed to Pete Morrison's ranch. The old man was retiring and had offered them first right of refusal. "What do you think?" Eli asked. "About building something even bigger?" "I think," Clara said, turning to face him, her eyes shining with a light he'd never seen before, "that we're going to need the space." She placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Doc Patterson says we can expect our first little Boone Maddox rancher by next summer." The big, tough sheriff's eyes filled with tears. He swept her into his arms, his heart overflowing with a joy so profound it was almost painful. All the running, all the fighting, all the fear, It had all led to this, to her, to a future he never dared to dream of. That evening, as they sat on their porch, he watched her gaze at the fence post. There, where he'd once left a carved horse for a little boy, sat a new creation he'd whittled in secret. A tiny, perfect wooden cradle. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "None," she said, her hand covering his. "The only thing I regret is that it took us so long to find each other." "We found each other exactly when we were supposed to," Eli replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything before, that was just the long road home." The story of Clara and Eli reminds us that true strength isn't found in being untouchable, but in having the courage to fight for what you love. It's a testament to the fact that even in the harshest landscapes, the most beautiful things can grow. If their story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You never know what other tales of love, loss, and justice are waiting to be told in the shadows of the past.